Everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on the new planning white paper. It's a very hot topic. It's filling a lot of column inches within our trade press. And this morning we have with us Claire Dutch, who's the co-head of planning at Ashurst Solicitors, a very famous international set of solicitors. And Claire is fresh from her keynote speech yesterday at the London Development Planning Conference, but more particularly her presentation to the MCLG committee earlier this week, the subcommittee led by Clive Betts, where I understand she was mauled but left unscathed. Following on from Claire, we've got Mike Taylor from Chilmark Consulting.
Morning.
One of the country's leading consultancies with regard to housing need and employment studies. And then we have Oliver Deed from Engage, Communicate and Facilitate, who are, again, leaders in their field with regard to public consultation.
I'll take that.
And finally, I'm afraid you've got me talking about viability, but I'm afraid a lot of you know me, and therefore we'll drop off at that point, I'm sure. Okay, so we're going to hand over to Claire, who's going to take us through the wider spectrum of the white paper and what it might mean for us all.
Great. Well, thank you, Andy. Thanks for the big up. Speaking at this conference is a bit of a dream compared to being grilled by the Parliamentary Select Committee on Monday afternoon, which was quite an experience. Hopefully you can all see my slides now. So my job really is to give you a quick canter through the main proposals in the white paper. Unless you've been on Planning Mars for the last few months, you will have heard about the white paper and will know roughly what it's all about. So my talk is the planning white paper, what's all the fuss about? So quick recap, it landed on the 6th of August. It was quite mysterious. There was quite a big up about it. We were waiting for it for about a year and it finally arrived. Boris Johnson writes the foreword and he says it's radical reform unlike anything seen since World War II. Trust Boris to get a war reference in right at the beginning, one of his favourite topics. And is it radical? There's a bit of a debate about that. I think it is. The key ingredients of the planning system remain. We're still going to have plans, we're still going to have applications, there's still PD rights and developer contributions. That's, the structure is still there, but there's no doubt about it. It's proposing full-scale root and branch reform of all those areas. A key criticism, it's too broad brush. There are big sweeping utopian statements in this white paper with very little detail. A lot of people say it's actually a green paper. And I remember Steve Quartermain, who was a former government's chief planner, used to call it an apple white paper, which I think is quite a good description of it. And boy, has it caused a fuss. There have been 44,000 consultation responses to it. So it remains to be seen whether the government has the resources to sit down and review 44,000 reps. Anyway, so there's a lot of chat about pillars and whatever in the white paper. It basically boils down to 3 categories of reform. There's the plans, there's the applications, and there's the developer contributions. And I'm going to just quickly canter through each one. Starting with the plans. Now, I would say this is the crown jewel reform of the white paper, really. This is the heart of it. So to understand how everything else works, you've really got to get to grips with what they're saying about plans. Now, rather than a big telephone directory-sized plan, which lands on a desk like with a doorstop, full of words and vague stuff, that's all going to go. We're going to have literally a plan. That's what they're saying. An online, digital, interactive plan. That sounds novel, where you'll be able to go on the website, you'll be able to find your site, you'll be able to hover over it, and you'll be able to say, oh, I can use this for residential. I can build up to 7 stories. I can get this amount of density. That's the theory. that these plans will set rules and parameters for sites, and they'll be quite granular. There's going to be 3 broad designations of sites, 3 broad categories: growth, renewal, and protected. I'll come on to that in a minute. And the government is going to tell local authorities, this is your housing number. This is how many houses you have to provide. And that's a change, because the government is saying letting local authorities come up with their own figure is taking far too much time. It's clogging up local plan examinations, etc. It's not really working. And all this new digitized new world plans, this is all going to be put in place in a mere 30 months. So whether that's achievable remains to be seen. So going on to the 3 broad categories, looking at these a bit in a bit more detail. Some people say it's not zoning. The government is quite clear this isn't a zoning system. Simon Gallagher's publicly said that, the Director of Planning. I heard a good description about it yesterday. Somebody said it's zoning light, and I would agree with that, because it's very broad. It's a very broad, light way of zoning, in that if your site falls in the growth category, we're talking about big urban extensions, the big sites, there is a possibility that the developer can walk away with outline planning permission. Sounds great. My developer clients are certainly saying, well, what does that mean? Is it a bare outline like the old days? That's not going to give, take matters forward, really, because all the detail will be shunted down to reserve matters. So there's a bit of skepticism about what this outline permission is actually going to deliver. I'm going to skip renewal. I'm going to go straight to the other extreme, which is protected. Now, a lot of people think I've read the white paper to decide, and have come to the view that protected is really just greenbelt. It's not. Actually, protected covers conservation areas as well. And when you're particularly working in London, say Westminster, large swathes of Westminster are a conservation area. Large swathes of Westminster will be in the protected zone, and any development at all will be restricted, and you'll need a planning application. So those are the 2 extremes. And in the middle, we have a category called renewal, which nobody really knows what renewal means. It's this broad, amorphous category of brownfield land that will all be lumped into this middle category. The Mayor of London obviously doesn't like it, because he's saying most of London will be in renewal. And then it's not clear what the rules are for renewal. There's talk about enhanced PD rights. There's talk about a fast track, a favourable planning system for beautiful schemes. So it's all not clear. Now, if you don't accord with the plan, because the idea behind all this is the plan sets the rules and applications will go in which match the plan and tick. Big green tick on the computer, developer walks away with a planning permission. If you don't comply with the plan, you will have to put in a plan application, and the government's quite clear about this. These sorts of applications which don't comply should be the exception rather than the rule. And certainly my developer clients are saying, even if the plan sets the level of granularity that is needed, and there's debate about whether that's going to happen, they are concerned that the parameters will be too conservative, it will play it too safe. And developers, like, I better not name them actually, but the big developers are saying, we suspect that we will end up putting in planning applications that don't conform with the plan, and we will have to appeal them if necessary. So that is a very quick look at plans. Turning now to decisions, the planning applications. I think a lot of people have overlooked lots of little rules that they're proposing to bring in, because it's all been overshadowed by all this plan, the changes to the plan making system. So there's quite a lot in this bit. More decisions made by officers rather than members. And you can see why the government's saying that, because the whole idea is that an officer will just look at a nice tidy application which matches the rules in the plan and they'll give it a tick. Why bother with members? Members have already signed off the rules at the plan stage. Developers are quite liking that because obviously political uncertainty. We've all been at committee meetings with our hearts in our mouths. Planning application fee returned if not decided within the statutory timescales. Not heard much about that. Developers don't seem that bothered about getting the money back. They'd rather get the consent. Deemed approval rather than deemed refusal. That's a change. I suspect local authorities, you won't like that. And one local authority chap said to me recently, that really means refusal. Because if we get to the end of the timescale, we're not going to have a deemed approval, we'll just refuse it. Planning applications, documents nice and short and punchy. No document more than 50 pages. Wow, that's great. Hopefully we will be able to comply with that and show some discipline in the industry. Digitization we talked about, streamlining EIA. This is good. I mean, my word, EIAs now, you know, environmental statements now run to 3, 4 tombs of data, etc. Let's just hope it is really a genuine push for cutting down a paper, which will help the environment in itself, rather than weakening environmental protection. So this is a Herculean effort to move to this new system, this new upskilling on digitization, etc. Who is going to pay for all this? And the white paper is very clear about that. It doesn't pull any punches. It says the applicant will pay. There'll be increased planning application fees. There'll be increased PPA fees. If the developer wants to appeal, they'll have to pay for it, which is a change. And also the infrastructure levy, unlike SIL, the government saying part of it can go to resourcing the planning system. So that's a change. So that is a good segue onto my third and final topic, developer contributions. Now, first of all, dealing with this new, shiny, utopian infrastructure levy, all very simple, single payment. Let's not beat about the bush. This is what SIL was intended to do 10 years ago, and it got incredibly complex very quickly. It's going to be value-based. It's land value capture. The government is very blatant about that. The sector of land value capture has been hovering over the development industry for many a year, and the development industry have pushed back, but the government is saying, no, we want a slice of the pie. We want a slice of the final value of the development. There's going to be a flat rate charge, and that's going to be set at the date of the planning permission, but it's going to be paid on occupation. And that is a double-edged sword, really. There's good and bad about that. Developers are telling us, well, it's better than SIL. SIL comes in like a sledgehammer liability the moment I put my spade in the ground. And some SIL bills are 20 million, 30 million, 40 million, which can really stymie a developer progressing. I quite like the idea it's paid on occupation. The downside is that you won't know the final figure, really, what you are going to pay. You'll know the rate. The rate will be set at the date of the planning permission, but you won't know your final value of your development. You can have a guess, but the market may change, etc. So it creates uncertainty. Secondly, local authorities will not get their hands on this money till quite far down the process, which means that to provide the infrastructure in time, the whole idea is local authorities will have the appetite to borrow to forward fund infrastructure off the back of future levy receipts. And whether local authorities want to take that risk, particularly in a market like we're in at the moment, remains to be seen. It's going to be nationally set, although there is talk potentially locally set, but the way the mood on the street is it's going to be set by central government. It's going to replace sale. Everybody be cheering about that. Sales cause lots of problems, but mayoral sale, so strategic sale like the Mayor's Crossrail sale in London, that will remain. Is it going to be the end of 106? I personally think the government's done a bit of a U-turn on this. If you read the white paper, it's blatantly clear they want to scrap 106. They don't like all these horrible lawyers delaying the process. 106 is just not efficient, and let's just get rid of it. Everybody has been up in arms about that. Local authorities and developers actually saying that 106 is a very flexible tool for dealing with all kinds of things, not just pound, shilling and pence, deals with sustainable transport, local labour, car-free, long-term stewardship of open space, deals with all sorts of stuff. You can also shove it in a 106 agreement. The government has now started to say, oh, we never said we'd get rid of 106, but what they're mooting now is that 106 will not deal with anything financial, it will just deal with the non-financial obligations, which I think is quite a good thing. And what is the aim of all this? The aim of it is clear. Boris thinks we're not getting enough money from Section 106 and FIL. So they just want to basically introduce a system which is more efficient and developers pay more. So turning now to the other side of developer contributions, affordable housing. Now I would say, Andy may disagree with me here, I would say this is the worst written bit of the white paper, in that it's had quite a few people scratching their heads about what things mean. It's a bit vague. It's clear, what we can say, it's clear that affordable housing is expected to be provided on site. And it's expected to comply with the local authorities' quantum requirements, the tenure requirements. How is it going to be secured? Because there's talk that it won't go in a 106 agreement. I think it probably will, actually. It'll stay in 106. So that's an issue. How is it going to be secured? The important point to note is that the developer will get a rebate or a discount from the infrastructure levy for the cost of the provision of the affordable. So it's offset against the infrastructure levy. I think the rules around that will become quite complicated about what you can and can't offset. And then if a local authority thinks I'm not getting enough money from the infrastructure levy, it can have the ability to say to a developer, can you flip those back to private, because we'd rather have the infrastructure levy rather than the affordable housing, is my take on how it's going to work. And then there's stuff in the white paper about perhaps local authorities and RPs having the first right of refusal to buy some of the units on site to use as affordable housing. So final slide, you'll be pleased to hear. What happens next? A lot of clients have said, what's the timescale and all this? Well, the government has set itself an extremely, extremely ambitious timescale. They want all this new system in, the digitisation, the plans, everything else, by the end of their parliamentary term, which is May 2024. Now, if you think the government's giving local authorities 30 months to make the plans, working backwards, from my calculation, that means that all this new law has to be in to get the system up and running by autumn next year. Now, I think the government again has started to backtrack slightly. Joanna Aveley, who is now the new government's chief planner, said at a conference we spoke at yesterday, it's going to take some years to bring this in. She sort of seems to distinguish between the big chunky changes, like which I take to mean the plan changes. She said it's going to take a good few years to get all that law in and people moving to that system. However, she has said that there'll be an announcement before Christmas on the programme of reform going forward. And she said the government is prioritising things that they can do with the current system under the current legislation, like set up the design bodies and design codes, etc. That's going to, announcements on that will come before Christmas. well, we'll wait and see with bated breath. Anyway, that's my quick canter through the white paper.
Thanks very much, Claire. And now we're going to move on to Mike, who's going to take us through the housing needs standard method of measurement, to use my surveying terms. It probably Mark 4 or 5, is it, Mike? But I'm sure you'll give us a history lesson on that.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you, Claire, also for a very helpful overview of things, because there's an awful lot to take in. I've got the slightly more anarchy role of looking particularly at housing needs and the standard method for a few minutes, and I promise it will be brief, and not least of which because we've got a moving feast still here, haven't we? Hopefully you can all see the slides okay at this end. So let me just get that advanced. There's 3 things I'm going to try and cover in the next sort of 10-15 minutes. And I promise a very, very brief history of housing targets, which sounds even more painful than when I was writing it. A quick look then at the standard method as it was, and I think most people will be familiar with the housing needs standard method and what it's done and what it's doing, and the current one that's being proposed. And then we've got to look at what's going on in future as well, because this is a sort of a moving feast. So just moving forward. It wasn't really until I started putting this together that I realised just how much stuff's being talked about in terms of trying to calculate housing numbers, even in the last decade or so. So I'm just running back to 2009 and 10 with the removal of the regional spatial strategies, which really set top-down housing numbers for every area and said to local authority, you've got to provide these numbers, thank you very much. We've then had this whole sort of run through the MPPF and this approach of the objective assessed need, leading through to the duty to cooperate to make sure people actually try to meet the need. And there's an entire history lesson in cooperation to be discussed there in another day. And then sort of increasingly clear that actually calculating objective assessed needs is quite a complex thing. And as the government rightly said, it's taken a huge amount of time at local plan examinations. And I've spent many happy times sat grilling and being grilled by various barristers about numbers and calculations and how it's worked out and all the rest of it, which is a colossal waste of time actually in a lot of cases, because you're talking about fairly marginal changes. So it's kind of collectively understood that development plans not really meeting sort of national targets, however they're set, and that currently of course it's 300,000 homes per annum and 1 million by the end of the Parliament. And we've had various interventions, things like local plans expert group, looking at how you might change objective assessed need calculations to make them more responsive to economic circumstances and so on and so forth. But effectively, the government decided that a standard method would be the best way forward, nice and simple, transparent, easy for people to understand how it's worked out, and clearly something which was going to take a lot less time to argue about, frankly. So we got in 2018 a standard method, and I'll come on to it in a second. That led to 1 or 2 interesting problems, issues. So we're now looking at a revised method, and obviously then the white paper is also proposing something different as the planning reforms go forward. So just very briefly, the standard method, the current one, I think it's been in operation for a couple of years, and I think there's a lot of issues that are pretty well known with it now. It's past trend based, so it tends to project forward what's happened in the past, and it's proven to be very volatile in terms of household projections and change over time. And critically, the method doesn't nationally add up to 300,000 homes. I think it's been fairly well understood for a while, and obviously the reason for looking at changes now. It suppresses growth in, well, as you can see, courtesy of Litchfield's there, that graphic, crudely, it suppresses household growth and housing need in the north and parts of the Midlands, and indeed 1 or 2 other parts, and overheats in particularly in the southeast and the southwest, and in some parts of London as well. And there were very, very substantial increases in housing numbers that were input. And I'd also argue that it really stopped a proper understanding of the link between demographic need and economic growth and regeneration objectives as well, which still ended up being points of discussion at local plan examinations anyway. So whether it really saved a huge amount of time, I'm not sure. And indeed, I've been to a number of examinations recently, and I've got another one coming up where housing need is still a whole day's topic. So it hasn't really necessarily saved us a lot, although the points of argument might be slightly different. It's still very much there. So then, you know, long trail that we were going to have some tweaks to the methodology, and then in August this year, alongside the white paper, the government have announced what I call standard method 2, I suppose. I can't think of a better phrase for it. Which the technical paper that came out with the document tries to use, well, effectively a number of things. It's trying to use more up-to-date data. It's a refinement of the algorithm, really trying to achieve, as it says in its own terms, a better distribution of homes, and avoiding putting avoiding unaffordable areas in high demand, planning for low housing numbers, which the original standard method seems to have a big problem with. Government also encouraging a model that provides more stability, it's more predictable for local authorities as well over time, and therefore, crucially, is consistent with meeting their 300,000 per annum housing target nationally. So they've introduced a number of factors around using housing stock as a measure of a balancing factor to just household growth and projection, and also looking at affordability of housing over time rather than just an absolute figure, which was one of the problems with the previous standard method. Having said all that, you'll be very, very well aware, I'm sure, if you've read the news recently, of a series of problems. And the graphs, I appreciate you may not be able to see them very easily, but when we share the slide decks, perhaps you can. These are drawn from research, again, from Litchfields and Turley, who do quite a lot of work in this area nationally, which is very helpful. But it's clear that using this algorithm results in huge growth, again, in the southeast and in London, particularly the south of the country, and actually ends up with plans in the north, probably with lower housing requirements than even they're calculating on their own ground using OAN, or indeed achieving at the moment. So again, it's failing as it stands to meet its own needs as the government intended. And you'll have seen some of the headlines that are resulting. These are just a snapshot of things I've picked up in the last week or two, and you can Google them yourself and find probably an awful lot more. So where we are today is, by the time I finish speaking to you, the government may well have announced another version of how this is going to work. It's clear that it doesn't work. There's been an awful lot of debate in Parliament about it, and there's a serious number of both Conservative and indeed other MPs who are very concerned about the way in which this revised method of identifying housing is going to work out. The problem is we don't know how they're going to rebalance it yet. I haven't seen that in detail. So where we are, it still needs tweaking. I suppose the key point is it actually just proves that a simple, straightforward algorithm method isn't necessarily the right way to go in establishing something which is actually a very fundamental and complex issue, really. But there's even more, because the white paper proposes to do something additional. And particularly I'll draw attention to this white paper proposal number 4, and I've clipped some of the text up onto the screen there so you can see that. And as Claire's already said, government's intending to move to a position where they'll calculate the housing number for you as a local authority and tell you what it is, and that figure will be binding. So effectively they're moving to a top-down approach which distributes housing numbers from the top. And as we'll see in a second, it's a policy on figure because it's taking into account land factors and constraints and availability, et cetera, as well. So it's a very, very different move. So as I understand it at the moment, the standard method will continue until this reform of the planning system comes through in more detail, at which point this will then become the way. The reason I said going back to the future is because largely it starts to look like replication in some ways of the sort of regional spatial strategy handouts of housing. If you were being critical of that RSS approach, it was very much, here's a number we've worked out at examination for the regional strategy, and that's what you'll have to deal with, just get on with it. Also has some benefits, I suppose, in other ways. Certainty there was no further argument about that, or people may say differently. But I've tried to unpack it a little bit more in the last couple of slides here. And obviously it's a white paper, so it's not entirely clear or fully detailed what's proposed. But as far as I can see, at the heart of it and in the center of that sort of circle is a revised version of the standard method number 2. So whatever they come up with in the next few weeks is the starting point. And then someone in government is going to have to look at the issues they've said in the paper, white paper about land constraint, primary and secondary levels of constraints. So question where national parks, greenbelt, area of outstanding natural beauty, all of those sort of very, very important national designations, where they come into it. Assessment of a buffer of additional need or additional need for non-implementation of planning consent. So when permissions are expected but not granted, how do you factor that sort of issue in? And then an allowance for land needed for other things. It's not just housing, but clearly commercial land, green space, amenity space, agriculture, everything else effectively that the planning system needs to think about, needs to be factored into this. And then as the government is saying, looking clearly at opportunities for brownfield land and densification of that as well. So all of that is sort of wrapped up in what the white paper is saying a proposal for. But again, the clarity of how that's going to work, who's going to do it, is yet to be determined. So as a sort of final slide, just some questions and thoughts really from me, and some of these are things I can see. Others are, looking at a number of commentators around the subject. These are sort of some of the issues that are coming potentially down the line if we move to this sort of binding top-down approach again. It becomes a difference between a formula-based approach, which is, I'll call it objective, it's sort of objective, at least it's numerical, versus effectively one of a professional planning judgment. But the question then is, in terms of transparency, is who's doing these calculations and how reliable is the data that's going into it? What are those inputs to this set of calculations, this wider analysis that balances demographic and household need with all the land constraints and viability issues? What are the timescales for updating and reviewing this? I mean, is it every year? Is it every 10 years? What's the position there? And then crucially, how will this factor in accounting for economic change, regeneration initiatives, infrastructure provision, and that sort of investment, which clearly this government and no doubt future governments will be very, very keen to see. And a few other sort of questions really. Neighbourhood plans, they're here to stay. How do they fit within this? Will that be additional housing on top of what's being set as the binding target? Where does that play out? We don't know at this stage. And then just well, from experience again at RSS stage, how resilient will all this be to legal challenge? Certain RSSs, they had their plan numbers challenged in particular places, and in one or two cases the number was quashed and they had to go back and reset the plan and come up with different numbers. Is this liable? Possibly. I mean, there's plenty of moving parts here that could be challenged potentially. And how is it resilient to what I've called local political challenges and representation, legitimate rights of local elected members to look at these numbers and say, well, this doesn't look like what our borough or district should be doing. But if it's binding, then obviously the local plan, in order to be sound or whatever the terminology will be in future, needs to make sure it's providing that level of land. So as a sort of concluding thought, there's some very interesting ideas to move things forward, to getting this country to deliver the sort of levels of housing that have consistently been talked about, but actually a hell of a lot of challenges in terms of how does this play out and where will we see, where will we find this proposal in future. So I think that's really it from me for the moment, but obviously plenty of time for some questions on it, I think, in due course. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And before we move on to Oliver, a reminder to everybody, if you've got any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and we'll get to those at the end of the programme. So handing over now to Oliver Deed from ECF, who's going to tell us how to get on with these consultations, which are apparently needed right at the start of the local plan process, Ollie.
Oh, you've ruined my presentation, Andy. That was a whole thing. Thank you very much for having me. And I have to say, it's great to be on a panel of some serious heavy hitters. And I feel like I'm drowning in technical expertise. So being a community engagement specialist, I'm going to take it out of the technical and into the visionary, and hopefully give you a few ideas as to what local authorities should be doing moving forwards with community engagement, irrespective of whether the planning white paper comes forward or not. The great thing about community engagement is that over the last 9 months or so, things have evolved quite significantly. So it means that there are improvements that local authorities can be making over the period of the next few weeks and months, regardless of what the government does or does not do in terms of planning policy. And I direct you to this slide. This was the last public exhibition that I actually attended. This chap's the chairman of Crystal Palace Football Club on a project that we worked on around their training ground. And I was musing to colleagues the other day, is this the last physical public exhibition that we ever attend? And the conclusion that we've all drawn is no. So what am I going to do in this presentation? Well, very briefly, I'm going to talk about what community engagement looks like currently, what the white paper proposes, some of the reaction to these particular measures, and Claire and Mike have touched on some reaction in their fields, and I'll talk a bit about local democracy and community engagement. Some of the tools that local authorities can consider moving forwards, and then sort of hypothesize about what the future might look like. So I'll just zip through this because this will be very familiar to local authority officers who are on the line today. Local plan, community engagement, effectively two-stage. You have your Regulation 18 stage engagement with the local community, and you have your Regulation 19 stage community engagement process. So when we come on to what the government is proposing, it does not look too dissimilar in terms of the number of engagement points, but that is the process around a local plan currently. And I don't want to get into the sort of nitty-gritty of that because they're getting rid of it. Then in terms of planning applications, generally, we have developer-led pre-application community engagement processes governed by a local authority statement of community involvement. I'm not sure what the future of those will be moving forwards. Also governed by the provisions in the Localism Act and the NPPF. And then in this spaghetti soup of community engagement activity, you have ancillary parallel master planning and policy making processes such as neighbourhood plans, SPDs, and all of those are subject to some form of community engagement, which does vary across the country. So that's sort of a brief overview of my experience currently of what local authorities are doing around community engagement. And I picked out a couple of key quotes from the white paper that I thought really summed up the direction that the government is looking to take community engagement. So the first is our reforms will democratise the planning process by putting a new emphasis on engagement at the plan making stage. So I think it's worth saying, as Andy alluded to earlier, that we are going to move away from a process of community engagement on individual planning applications, and the government is looking to front-load community engagement, effectively lay the burden, I'm afraid to say, on local authorities to undertake best-in-class or best practice community engagement during the plan-making process, hopefully to get rid of all the arguments that we have over individual planning applications. I think that's a rather fanciful proposition. And then the second element to this is that new digital engagement processes will make it radically easier to raise views about and visualize emerging proposals whilst on the go on a smartphone. So you as an individual should now, whilst you're having your coffee in whichever chain's left after COVID has done its work, you can look through your phone and you'll be able to pick up a planning application on a map within your local area and really easily put your comment forward. So let's see how that manifests itself over the coming months and years. So this 30-month local plan process, what the government have retained is the idea of having 2 engagement points. So as Claire said in her presentation, the idea is that you'll have an interactive map-based local plan. So the idea would be that you as a resident would be able to sit on your computer or sit on your smartphone, access this map, go into your local area and be able to readily and easily identify all of the policies that pertain to your local area, and all of the a whole series of statistics around everything from flood risk to conservation areas to proposed heights. This should all be available to you on a map rather than a whole series of PDFs as we currently have. And this effectively will facilitate 2 engagement points in the 5-stage local plan making process. So at stage 1 of that process, which is alluded to be 6 months, you will have a community engagement process that will effectively have a series of calls for. So that would be things like, what category should your area be in? Should it be one of these protected areas, or should it be a growth zone, or should the area up the road be a growth zone and your area be a protected area? Because of course you don't want too much growth in your local area. So there is in that first instance a period where local authorities will be encouraged to go out and to deliver a best-in-class public involvement process that will generate views and feedback that will be fed into plan making processes that undergo in that 30-month period. And the government haven't really clarified what best in class is. I mean, I've got some ideas about what that might look like, but we await to see the guidance that they'll come forward with moving forwards. And then at stage 3 of the plan making process, and this is not too dissimilar to the Reg 19 consultation that currently takes place, there'll be a period of consultation on the plan itself. So the plan will be issued for comment, but interestingly, the government want that consultation to take place at the same time that the plan is submitted for examination, so that effectively those processes will run in parallel. So some of the comments that I've had from local authority friends of mine is that if significant serious issues come up at that stage 3 consultation, but you've already submitted a plan for examination, what's the mechanism actually of amending your local plan to reflect those concerns? And do you have to resubmit your plan? How is that going to work in practice? And that's something that we are looking for the government to clarify once it's processed 44,000 comments that it's received, and good luck with that. On planning applications, the key quote is that they are looking to streamline the opportunity for consultation at the planning application stage. And the rationale for this, and I have some sympathy with this, is that at the moment, pre-application planning processes and then your post-submission statutory consultation process does seem to elicit comments from the so-called NIMBY brigade. If you look at the demographics of the people that tend to respond to consultations, it's much older than average, much people that own houses already, and effectively these are people that are not conducive to wanting growth in their particular area. Obviously, one of the key things that's come out of this is the idea that an automatic outline permission within a growth area will undermine the democratic process, because at the moment, if you're coming forward with an outline planning application, there is obviously a statutory requirement to undertake pre-application consultation, but effectively in our reading of the white paper, that will go as a result of these particular proposals. So we can see that there are battles that will gear up during these sort of reformed reserve matters applications in growth areas. So is it a case of just delaying the inevitable, that there is going to be a row, but rather than have your row at the outline stage through the planning process, you're going to have your row at the reserve matters stage? And the white paper also talks about specific planning applications coming forward in renewal and protected areas, and we're not clear yet as to what the requirements will be for pre-application consultation from a developer perspective. And what they say is, we will consider most effective means for neighbours and other interested parties to address any issues of concern where under this system the principle of development has been established. So from my perspective, I think there's probably a compromise coming down the line whereby individuals will get the opportunity to comment on some form of outline planning application, even within these growth areas, because I'll come on to the reaction that these proposals have, but I can't see how they're going to get this through the system. Neighbourhood plans, moving back to the point about digital tools, neighbourhood plans obviously remain, but the government would like to see more digital tools utilised in the process of producing those neighbourhood plans. And that might be in the form of so-called co-creation platforms or 3D visualisation technologies. And I'll actually talk a little bit about those 3D visualisation technologies in a moment. And then design guidance and design codes. Interestingly, the government have made reference to genuine community involvement rather than meaningless consultation on locally prepared design guidance and design codes. So does that add another layer of complexity and community involvement from a local authority perspective? At the moment, it looks like local authorities generally deliver quite simple engagement processes on their local plan. It feels to me like we're moving to what would be a very sophisticated, multi-layered requirement for community engagement from a local authority perspective. And, for the officers that are on this call, that probably strikes fear into your heart, because you're going to be out in the community an awful lot more by the sounds of things. And then in terms of the infrastructure levy that I know Andy's going to come on to, there's this so-called neighbourhood share of the infrastructure levy that the white paper talks about. And again, they're looking at ways that the community can be engaged in the process of actually determining where that money is spent. So is that another layer of community engagement that local authorities are going to have to undertake as a result of the white paper proposals? Just to talk briefly about some of the reaction, I've taken a selection of sort of stakeholders. Campaign for Rural England obviously are quite hostile to these proposals across the board, but they feel that the process of having outline consents within growth zones would undermine the democratic process that's been reflected by the TCPA. Local authority leaders in London, particularly Labour authorities, have hooked onto this being less democratic and involving less community involvement. Although I'm not sure I do agree with that, but I'll leave it up to you to determine. My favourite quote is this last one from Paul Bartlett, and I know we've got some people from Ashford Borough Council on the call. He said these specific proposals are more akin to something you'd find in North Korea. So I presume that he and his colleagues will be on a field trip to the Pyongyang planning department within the next few weeks to find out exactly how you deliver these type of proposals. So I don't think I'll be joining you on that one. And then back to the Campaign for Rural England. They polled backbench Conservative MPs and released their data a couple of days ago. 55% of the 40 that they surveyed said they were considering opposing the proposals, and 88% of people think that communities should have a say on specific applications within their area. So from my perspective, it looks like the Labour Party are geared up to oppose these proposals, and there could be quite a significant backbench rebellion within the Conservative Party. So that says to me that one of these is coming down the line on these proposals. What that will look like, I don't know, but I think there is going to have to be some compromise on the level of engagement that we will see within those so-called growth areas. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the practicalities, because irrespective of whether these white paper proposals are implemented or not, there is a move towards greater digitisation within the community engagement space that's largely been led by the private sector, but increasingly local authorities are adopting some of these technologies. And I should confess, I don't have any stake in any of these tools. We've used various different digital engagement tools to engage with communities, and these are some of the best that we've found. So if you're looking for a mapping tool for your local plan, you want something that's visual and interactive, you might look at something like Commonplace, which is a really innovative way of getting people to comment on proposals that you're bringing forward in a particular area. Really good mapping tool that I'd encourage you to look at. If you're looking to gamify your process, or you're looking to geofence, as they would call it, your area for engagement, something like Built ID is a really good option. And in terms of how to spend your neighbourhood share of an infrastructure levy, something like Built ID might be the platform that you use. It has a series of polling tools and the such like that you could potentially use to deliver a community engagement campaign on the infrastructure levy. We use a program called Engagement HQ quite a lot, and there are a few local authorities on this call that are already using this, that has a series of different engagement tools that you can use to really encourage people to engage on planning related issues, healthy streets related issues, whatever it might be. And then there's this one that I came across very recently called Hello Lamppost, which has been brilliant in the pandemic. And what it is you have activated objects within the public realm, and you have QR codes that people interact with. So you hover your phone over this QR code, and then you can have a text interaction with an automated sort of chatbot type thing that would help collect feedback, whether it be on the local plan, whether it be on bin collections, whatever it might be. And this has been a really good way to engage with people in the pandemic. And it's something that you might use on digital planning notices moving forward, for instance, as a way to encourage people to engage. And then just to talk briefly about 3D visualization tools, and I'm conscious that I'm overrunning, so bear with me. You've got two that we're looking at the moment. So you've got one called View City that a few people may well have seen, and this is a really innovative way of effectively taking all of the data that is out there and scraping the internet for all of the data that you need to effectively build these different layers of information. So what you can see here is that they've mapped up the City of London, and effectively what an applicant or what a local authority can do is effectively model buildings within the public realm, which allows people to go down to a street view level and actually view how those proposals will impact on their day-to-day lives. And you can layer all sorts of different pieces of information on top of that. So if we do move to this not a zoning system, you could layer over where the growth zones are, where the protected areas are, where the renewal areas are within your local authority area. And that'd be a really interesting, innovative way that people could look in and find out exactly what policies pertain to their particular area. And we're working with a company out in Australia at the moment. This came out of the Urban Development Institute of Australia, called Urban Pinboard, and it does a similar thing, and it allows local authorities to map different scenarios around things like building heights and the such like. And this could be an innovative tool that could be part of the mix moving forwards in terms of 3D visualization. I'll just touch on this briefly. Here's a challenge to the local authorities that are on the call. Who's going to be the first local authority that convenes a citizens' assembly on their local plan? There's the question. Demographically representative group could make recommendations about what should happen moving forwards in terms of your local plan. Who's going to be the brave one that does this first? We've had lots of them on climate change. Who's going to be the first one to do it on a local plan? And I think my sort of last conclusion really is that traditional methods will still remain. So the public exhibition, the community workshop will remain the tools in the arsenal, regardless of whether these plans are implemented or not. This is I've got a couple of pictures of a community workshop style event that we did for Enfield Council on a few of their public spaces, where we replicated the physical community workshop using Google Jamboards and Zoom breakout rooms to create a really good mechanism to gather feedback from people out and about in the community. And this is going to be a method that remains moving forwards, regardless of any reform that the white paper comes forward with. I think I'm running out of time, so much of this I've already said, but I think the last point is the point I want to reiterate. I said regardless of the white paper and what happens, community engagement has to change, and the local authorities who adopt better practices now and think deeply about how community engagement will influence their policy making process moving forwards will be the ones who are best placed to deal with this change when it does finally come through. Andy, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ollie. As always, the community engagement lasts longer than the planning application, but we'll move on. Don't worry. Okay, sorry. Now then, anybody wanting to give us another question? We've got a few coming in. Please do so. I'm now going to give you my screen in terms of the planning white paper. Okay. Now, for the boring bit, infrastructure levy and the latest iteration. Well, I'm sitting here feeling somewhat vindicated because for several years I have been an advocate of a single levy because the system, to be fair, had become too complicated. So why do we need to change the system? Well, effectively, we've got a perception issue. We've got a lack of trust in viability assessments. The public don't trust the results that come out of them. I have to say this is down to a lack of understanding, but you can't get away from the fact that planning is a democratic process, and therefore it's up to all of us to try and educate people around these issues. But to date, that really hasn't worked. SIL itself in its current form is far too complicated. If you go to one authority or another, they have different definitions of the gross internal area. This is particularly relevant in London, but also in the southeast. And whether the rate has been indexed correctly is also a big issue. If I asked you to go to Regulation 40, which is how you calculate the SIL, the calculation that's shown there would perplex Einstein, I think. And we've had a big return of the overlap of SIL and Section 106, leading to duplication as far as the development industry is concerned. And actually the government did the clearest and worst of these insofar as in the MPPG last year, they brought back in education contributions as a separate Section 106 item rather than being covered by SIL. So the real problem is that at the moment, the public don't see a correlation between the current system and any improvements in their locality. Their cry, as soon as the planning application comes in, is that the infrastructure won't support it. So what's proposed? Well, at this point, I do feel like the author of an episode of The Crown, because I have a context, I have a document which tells us a broad framework, and it is very broad, as Claire alluded to, but we've got to try and fill in the gaps for you. So we know that we're going to get a single levy rate, but Joanna Averley yesterday on the conference that Claire and I attended and spoke at, stated that it will be a single calculation rather than a single rate to be paid across the country. Payable when the sale completes, well, this has often been a bone of contention, again, as Claire suggested, where developers haven't got any income at the point that the liability comes in when they put the spade in the ground. The other thing about pay when sales complete is that it does away with the issue of review mechanisms, because you're paying against the price that's achievable on the sale of the residential unit or the commercial property. There will be a threshold level. Now, this is quite important, and it will take a lot of work from central government to get this right. And I'll come on to regional variations in a minute. But it's going to be very important to ensure viability, because as you look across the country, clearly not all local authorities have chosen to implement a SIL. And in some areas, a SIL couldn't be paid whether you tried or not. Our work as viability consultants looks like it's going to disappear for the most part, but these two other items of affordable housing offset and infrastructure offset is where the focus is now going to move to. So we're going to be tasked, I believe, with establishing what the value of the affordable housing should be and what the infrastructure offset should be. That is not to say, and I don't think we should go back to the days, and I'm old enough to know this one, Section 52 agreements with fixed transfer values from developers to housing associations as they were then. All that system did was to enrich the housing association, but not protect the tenant. We've moved a long way forward in the last few years, where the focus of a 106 is on the delivery of affordable housing, the rate, the rents that are going to be paid, and the protections for the tenant. And that's what that should be about. So the offset and the infrastructure offset will be more of a calculation of cost rather than the value that the RP will pay. So how will it work? Well, it's very clear to me that setting a single national rate is not going to work. There's a question really for government as to whether it wants to apply the rates regionally or on a district basis. I've got a feeling they'll plump for the middle one, but when they really should go for the district rate. Again, will there be a rate per type, use type? And I think there absolutely should be. Why should, as somebody said to me yesterday, a wind farm in the Outer Hebrides pay the same rate as a flat in central London? Or a commercial rate, indeed, for retail when retail's on the floor. So there's going to have to be some thinking around the different use types. When it comes to how that threshold will be set, that's really going to have to be relevant to the sales and capital values of a particular area. So that is the real viability question here, because as one knows, you can't take more out of the pie than exists, and therefore that rate is going to have to be set at a level to ensure the viability of schemes in low value areas. Will the rate be per square metre or per unit? My preference, as is now, is it's per square metre, but the government is going to have to be very particular about setting what is that area calculation that is used. As I referred to earlier, you've got a situation at the moment where the gross internal area, which is used in a SIL calculation, can be varied, and that can cause problems. So viability, as I've said, will really be dealt with by the threshold and the rate itself. And here's the one that's not mentioned so much in the white paper, but it's certainly coming across in the discourse that's around this, and that is the levelling up agenda. So expect to see a top slicing of this infrastructure levy being taken by central government for redistribution to areas who can't really afford a levy in the first place themselves. In other words, where the threshold will be so high that none of the developments they've got will actually pay it. And if you think about it, this particular item, hidden away, is the one that Boris really wants, because you're not going to increase the take from a levy unless you are going to spread it across the country. So that then neatly takes us on to what do we do? So, as I said earlier, the biggest objection from community groups, and indeed a lot of councillors who get voted onto councils to try and stop certain developments, is that the infrastructure can't cope. One of the tenets of the white paper, as has been alluded to by my colleagues, is that it's trying to remove the adversarial approach around each planning application. And what they've proven thus far is that a focus on raising tax, i.e. SIL, is easy. How many councillors actually pay attention to what the SIL actually is on each application? They're more interested in the Section 106 spin-offs than the SIL because they can't control it. So that's easy to deliver, but the focus to remove this adversarial position is going to be on the IDP, the Infrastructure Delivery Plan. And again, this is me, should we say, adding in detail, having just spoken to a lot of people who are connected with the white paper. The IDP at the moment does exist. A lot of you will be producing it. But to be fair, it's somewhat of a tick box exercise. In the future, it's going to have to be flexible, it's going to have to be succinct, and it's going to definitely be digital. Joanna Averley, in her presentation yesterday to the conference, was very clear that big digital is going to be the backup to all of these changes. And I think this is where the focus is going to be for councillors. They will be held to account for the delivery of the infrastructure that is required, because they won't be able to necessarily stop the developments if they fall into the first two categories of growth and regeneration. So it's a change of culture, basically. One thing about the IDP that the planning white paper sets out is that it can provide both soft and hard infrastructure. So the days of dealing with purely capital contributions are gone. And as Claire suggested, it will be able to pay for some of the planning resource requirements that are needed to make the system work. Here again, I'm going to add some detail from discussions with people. The IDP, I think, will become a business plan which is overseen by Homes England. There's been a fundamental shift in the way Homes England operates over the last few years. It's become a bank, it's become a funding mechanism. The people within it have changed. Many of the people who were housing specialists are gone, and there's a lot more finance specialists in there. So they're in a good place to act as an overseer, an auditor of these plans. Again, as mentioned earlier, the payment for the SIL comes in at the time that the unit is sold. So we have a situation where there's a gap that needs to be funded. If the plan is the IDP is approved, then I can envisage a situation where the Public Works Loans Board is tasked with supplying the cash to fund the infrastructure between the point of needing it, i.e. early on, and the point of the SIL coming in, which again lends itself to the SIL actually being collected centrally and then dispersed back to pay off the loan. After, of course, the levelling up agenda has been dealt with by top slicing a bit off. So, is this utopia? I suppose it is. It could give opportunities for communities to decide in the early stages of a local plan on the projects that are needed. I remember attending a particular planning committee where I had done a review of a viability case, and this became a part 2 within the planning committee, so the public were excluded. I had done my best to balance the viability and to get the best affordable housing outcome, because that's the thing that gets squeezed. And I got lambasted by the chair of the committee for cutting back the cost of a roundabout, which was sorely needed but by the locals as far as she was concerned. So you can see there are always competing interests in these things and not always the obvious ones. So therefore, it will be in the early stages of the local plan for communities to decide on those infrastructure products and what their priorities are. The process should provide certainty, I put for land buyers, but also for the local authority. It takes away the issue of viability necessarily off the table. It gives everybody some certainty as to what's needed. However, that is gonna have to be underpinned by the digital technology and a local plan based on it. Otherwise, it's just not gonna work. If it all goes well, we get a speedier planning process. That's where the big question mark comes. And I think the government is starting to row back on its aspirations on timing. Certainly Joanna Aveley yesterday said that the legal work would take at least a year to get in place. And she was very clear that the local authorities who have a local plan in train should not stop work as several have done. So that tells me that there will be an allowance for those local authorities that have a local plan in train to conclude their work and join this new world at a later date. Again, guesswork, but one can only listen to what's being said. So thank you for that. And we'll now take any questions. Right, we had a question from a gentleman who was asking what happens where you've got high housing need, high land costs, and your new standard method of measurement, as I call it.
Yes. Well, I've answered that one online, so to speak, but I'm happy to sort of just to share it. I'll answer it as best I can, because the answer is I don't really know. Yeah, I mean, it seems to be, how do you square off need, affordability, high constraint, and in this particular question, you know, the example of Greenbelt around London, which you know is hugely apposite, as it is for other core cities. I mean, the point of the white paper proposed around binding target is that it will take account of land constraints, including things like primary constraints, as well as what I might call sort of policy constraints, Greenbelt, national parks, and so on. My expectation is that the need element, as in how many homes do we need, is likely to outweigh the constraints in the way that that's decided, but it's not clear who's going to balance that up. That's an issue. The standard method in the white paper, it says that it will be, I'm going to read it out, it says that it will be the responsibility of individual authorities to allocate land suitable for housing to meet the requirement. So I suspect government will be passing the buck back down to individual authorities, as they always have done. And that's where we've ended up for many years, particularly with relation to London and its level of need, how much is actually met within the capital, how much of it is likely to spill out into the wider south and east and the home counties. I don't think they'll necessarily provide a solution to that. I do wonder, and Oliver, you might, or indeed others might know or have a view, whether there's potential in all of this slightly untransparent process of setting a binding target within the ministry, where there'll be opportunities to lobby or advocate certain figures, or to weigh up certain issues more in the balance about how much land supply we've got in a particular area before these figures are handed out. I do wonder whether that's something which might be going on or could go on.
It probably will. It's certainly in an informal manner. I'm sure all sorts of characters will be lobbying MHCLG, but the majority of lobbying is going to have to come from local authorities and the politicians leading up local authorities, and we've already seen it happening around local authorities that are pushing back against the idea of centrally set targets. So yeah, that will inevitably happen, whether it happens through informal or formal channels. So I think that's that could well be the next great scandal of lobbying in planning.
Well, equally, but then if government is intended to hand down targets from on high, and I mean, there has to be a level of transparency, I think, with this, because otherwise it isn't going to be something that people will just accept. And that was one of the big criticisms of RSS in the past, you know, that it wasn't clear how these numbers were worked up. And even someone like myself, who sat through a lot of examinations, it still wasn't entirely clear how some of these figures ended up getting put together. Some of it was basically a compromise position that was agreed. So there has to, I think there has to be that role of, you know, of establishing broadly what the figure should be, and then probably allowing an opportunity for representation to really bring forward, you know, yes, in certain places, particularly where you've got Greenbelt, which government signals is something they still see as very, very much a part of the planning system, or in terms of, they make the point about national parks as well in the white paper and how important they are, that actually that is properly weighed in the consideration of setting a figure. So it might look a bit sort of behind closed doors, you know, smoke-filled room sort of approach, but actually that may well be the way that some of this ends up having to go, potentially. So, you know,
I attended something. I can't. Gosh, there's been so many webinars and stuff. But I think it might have been Simon Gallagher. But don't quote me on this. I think a local authority asked that very question to say, when you read the white paper, it seems I'm going to be lumbered with this figure, and that is it. There's no comeback. There's no right of appeal. And I think the answer was something along the lines of what you've just said, Mike, which is, yeah, there won't be a right of appeal or challenge or anything like that. But at the end of the day, we will discuss it with you and give the authority a reasonable time to, you know, if you've got a strong objection to it, it's clearly a bonkers figure because an algorithm's not worked out right. You know, there will be a discussion about it.
Yeah, it's inevitable. Unless
politicians will look. There's only so much political capital that the government has got. It's expending a lot on Brexit. It's expending a lot on COVID. Is it really willing to expend political capital on having rows about housing targets with councils? No, it's not. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a large part of this junked.
Well, I'll change the subject because we've got another question just come in, if I may, and that is the question we're being asked is what percentage will be top sliced to pay for levelling up? Now, I think that question actually needs to start with what's the levy rate going to be as a percentage? Now, it's interesting that several large firms who only work for developers have started doing a lot of research on what the current amount of affordable housing and Section 106 contributions and everything else adds up to. And you won't be surprised to hear that they've come up with very low figures. One quoted yesterday was around 6% in central London of GDV, gross development value. And others are doing similar things. Now, if this system is going to work, I'm going to quote 2020. So 20% of the value is your levy, and 20% of that gets top sliced to send out to the regions. What's my reasoning for that? Very, very clear in the aspirations of this white paper that it should deliver more than the current system. So in order to do that, the percentages are going to have to be, in my view, quite huge. Now, who's worried about that percentage? Actually, it will be the large landowners, the ones that certain authorities have to rely on. The HBF, the developers have already said, set it pretty well where you like, because it's moving to the back end of our cash flow. We're not worried. As long as it's a pan the country, it's all landowners that are affected. So therein lies, if you like, the benefit and the problem for the government is that they could go for a relatively large number, and therefore they will have a nice big fund to go spending elsewhere. But are they going to kill the golden goose? Now, there are certain landowners, won't name names, but there are some certain colleges around the country who own a lot of land. There are some certain religious establishments that also own a lot of land, who are basically saying, well, we've got a 200 or 300 year view on life. We're not interested in playing ball. The question will come how they can be persuaded to play ball, because the government is still reliant on some of those institutional owners to deliver on the large scale growth areas, maybe not the smaller areas. So I think that's going to be the hotly debated topic for the next year. Where should the levy be set, and how much gets top sliced? Don't know if the rest of the panelists have got a view on that.
Well, Andy, just to say, I just wondered how that sort of fits with what Rishi Sunak announced yesterday in terms of the 4.8 billion levelling up UK fund, where you can bid in, provided you have your local MP support, because it seems to me that one of the best ways of funding that would be through a national SIL and then redistribution.
Yes, yeah, and what he did yesterday chimes with this aspiration and my suggestion. Now, I'm very clear that my view there of 2020 is probably at the top end of what people are expecting. But when you move out to lower value areas and do that same calculation, and you don't do it in Westminster, the percentage taken by Section 106 and affordable housing is very large. Sorry,
can I just offer a counter view based on the practicalities? If you look at the electoral cycle, the Conservatives won the last election off the back of those red wall seats, hence the levelling up agenda. Based on Claire's timeframes, it looks like the government are going to have this system in place by 2024. When do we have a general election? 2024. So the reality is that in order to redistribute wealth from the south to the north, the government are going to have to find some other mechanism to finance that, and this is not going to be it. So my suspicion is that they will be worried about thwarting supply so much that they will be much more conservative about the figures than what you've just quoted, Andy. That would be my instinct.
The only thing I was going to add is the white paper doesn't really deal with this notion of slicing off a bit of the infrastructure levy and handing it out. But when I was on the select committee on Monday, the MPs were all over it, particularly in the session before mine, which the witnesses were from RTPI, RICS, REBA, and they were each asked, what do you think of this? Taking the money from the South, distributing it where it needs to go. And those organisations all said they were very supportive of it. The MPs lapped all this up, so I think that is definitely coming in, is my take on it.
Helped by the fact that the chair of the committee is the MP for Sheffield, of course.
Yes, Clive Betts, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, that concludes. We said we'd be done by 11:15. We've just a little overrun that, and we haven't got any further questions. So I'm going to say thank you to all three of you for joining us this morning and sharing your views on the white paper. As was said by Ollie at the top of this presentation on the first slide, we will be circulating the slides and a recording of the presentation so that you can watch it at your leisure. And it will be
if you're an insomniac.
Better than Netflix.
Good antidote. Anyway, thank you all for joining us. It's been very kind of you to spare your time, and we'll speak to you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks all.
Cheerio.